US Highway 64. Yeah. Okay. Here's the bad news. I got copyrighted on my US Highway 64 video, but now I'm doing my own version to work so hard on North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico and Arizona. I work so hard. It is from Whalebone Junction, North Carolina, through Arizona. This is from North Carolina, famous towns. I would rather see, I like Raleigh, Chattanooga, Memphis, Conway, Fort Smith, Tulsa, Raton, Farmington, and make its end on US 160. We get our mention for US Highway 64. It says we get it also mentioned for US 264. So US 64 begins. Here we are on Roanoke Island. Here's US Highway 264 for Williamstown, Swan Quarter, Belhaven, and Washington. Okay, we should get like Raleigh and Rocky Mountain. We get US Highway 13 and 17 for Everett and Tarboro. So we're going to join 13 and 17 southbound for Everett and Tarboro. Now we're going to lose US Highway 17 for Williamstown and Washington. But I'd like to see Wilmington and Jacksonville, North Carolina. And we're losing US 13 for Greenville. Now we're joining US Highway 258. Yes, we're losing US Highway 258. We're signed for Rocky Mountain and Nashville. Come on. Nashville? Are you kidding? So Rocky Mountain, still fine. We get Tarboro and Farmville. But this time, I am going to do the rest of the whole state. Tennessee and Arkansas. Because I will do it. We get a mention for US 301 for Wilson. Excellent. We get Interstate 95 North for Richmond. Southbound is signed for Fayetteville. Just remove Wilson. No need for Wilson. But Fayetteville is a great choice. Now we're joining US Highway 264 and make its final end for US Highway 264. Here we are on Interstate 87. We get Interstate 540 for Wake Forest. We get a mention for US 1. Alright, we get another mention for US 1 for Wake Forest. We get and we get Interstate 440. So we get Interstate 87 turning with Interstate 440 eastbound. And we get a mention for Interstate 480 for Durham. Benson should not be signed. We should get like Fayetteville. Now we're going to join Interstate 40 and US 64 for Durham. And look at how bad is Interstate 40 East signed. It's time for Benson. That should have been Fayetteville. And we need Interstate 95. And Interstate 40 East is signed for Wilmington. Now we get US 70 and US 401 signed for Gardner. So US 64 would be heading straight. We're losing Interstate 40. We get US 1 mentioned for Wake Forest. We're joining US 1 and 64. US 1 and US Highway 64 for Asheboro. Now we're losing US Highway 1. US 64 is signed for Pittsboro and Asheboro. Now we're joining US 501 and US 15 for Chapel Hill, Sanford, and Carthage. Now we're losing US 501, and we're losing US 15 also. We get US 421 signed for Sanford and Greensboro. We get Interstate 73 and 74 and 220 signed for Rockingham, and they're both signed for Greensboro. And we get US Highway 64 westbound signed for Lexington, North Carolina, which is the correct choice. We get no mention for the sign for Interstate 85. Interstate 85 can take you to Charlotte and Greensboro. Now we're joining US 70 and US US Highway 29 and US 70. And US 64 are both joining US 29 and 70. And we're losing US 29 and 70. US 64 signed for Mocksville. We get Interstate 285 and US 52 signed for Charlotte and Winston-Salem. We get a mention for US 158. Now we just joined US Highway 601. Now we're losing US Highway 601. US 64 is turning left to Interstate 40. Interstate 40 East is signed for Winston-Salem, and 40 West is signed for Statesville. No! This should have been Asheville, not Statesville. Now we meet Interstate 40 once again for Winston-Salem and Statesville. This should have been Asheville, not Statesville. We get no mention for Interstate 77 in Statesville. Now we're joining US Highway 21, our old friend. Now we're losing US Highway 21, so US 64 is turning straight. You get US 70, that will take you straight and left. So we're turning right on US 64. Okay, this is horrible. This should not be Mocksville or Taylorsville. This should have been Asheville and Winston-Salem. US 64 is the correct choice for Taylorsville, but I don't know. Interstates should not be signed like that. In Lenoir, you get US Highway 321. In Morganton, we get another mention for US 70 once again. Oh no, Interstate 40 is signed for Hickory and Marion. This should have been Asheville and Winston-Salem. And here's our old friend for US Highway 221 in Batcave, North Carolina. Why are we doing Batman references for Batcave? We should get like Henderson. So now we're just losing US 74 alternate. We get Interstate 26 eastbound. It should be Columbia, not Spartanburg. Do we get a mention for US 25? Yes, we do. US 25 is on the list. And yes, US 74 is also mentioned on Interstate 26 with US Highway 25. Now we're joining US Highway 276 in Brevard. And now we're losing US Highway 276. Here's the beginning of US Highway 178. Now we're going to join US Highway 441 and US 23 for Clayton and Murphy. Now we're losing US Highway 23 for Clayton and Atlanta. So US 441 is losing us. So now US 64 is signed for Murphy. No need for Hayesville. Now we're joining US Highway 19, 74, and 129 in Murphy. Now we're losing US Highway 19 and 129. It's time for Blairsville. No, this should have been Atlanta and Athens. And we get US Highway 64 and 74 signed for Chattanooga. Yes! We get Chattanooga. We get no welcome sign for Tennessee. We just get Tennessee state line. Whoa, we get US 411 sign for Chatsworth. Benton is a bad choice. This should have been Maryville or Sevierville. Now we're going to say goodbye to US Highway 74. We get Tennessee Highway 60 signed for Dayton, and US 64 is signed for Cleveland, which is a great choice. Now we're going to join US Highway 11. Here's US Highway 74. It'll make its final end on Interstate 75. It would end on Interstate 75 south to the Interstate 24 interchange. We get a mention on Interstate 59. Now we're joining Interstate 75 southbound, and this would be US Highway 74, but it ended on Interstate 75 ramp. But it would be continuing and make its end on the Interstate 24 and 75 interchange in Chattanooga. Now we're losing Interstate 75 South, US 11, and US 64 are both signed for Old Lee Highway. This should have been downtown Chattanooga. Here's US Highway 41, which will join us again. But we'll join it a little bit, while US 76 will head into Eastridge. Now we're losing US 41 and US 76. So US 11 and US 64 are both turning right. We get a mention where US Highway 27 is mentioned. Now we're going to join US Highway 41 and US Highway 72 as we leave Chattanooga. Now we're losing US Highway 11. It'll head into Trent, Georgia. While US 41 and 64 and 72 head straight. Now we're crossing the Tennessee River. You can see all the nice scenery and Interstate 24. Look at all this little nice looking scenery on this mountain. You can see how beautiful this is. Now we're going to say goodbye to US Highway 41. So US 64 and 72 are both heading straight. Now we're going to say goodbye to US Highway 72. So now we're going to join Interstate 24 for Nashville. Now we're losing Interstate 24. Interstate 24. So US 64 will head into Winchester. So I will continue this for like long timer. In Fayetteville, we get US Highway 231. We get Shelbyville and Huntsville. And Pulaski. Here's US Highway 431. That will take you to Huntsville and Lewisburg. And we're signed for Pulaski. And we get Interstate 65 for Nashville and Huntsville. Huntsville's an okay choice, but Birmingham should be better. We get US Highway 31. In Lawrenceburg, we get US Highway 43. I know that US Highway. Here's the beginning of US Highway 641. We'll be heading into Savannah, Tennessee. Here's the nice looking scenery on this Tennessee River. Oh no! Why is it signed Boulevard? This should have been Memphis. And we get US 45 signed for Corinth, which is good choice. We're signed for Henderson. US 45 is signed. We're losing US Highway 45. US 45 will just head into Jackson, Tennessee. So US 64 will just head into Boulevard. This is bad choice. This should have been Memphis. And we get Interstate 269 signed for Tunica, Mississippi, and Arlington. Collierville. This should have been Memphis, not Collierville. I pronounce it right. It's Tunica, Mississippi, not Tusa. It's Tunica, Mississippi now. And Arlington, Tennessee. We get Interstate 40 signed for Memphis and Nashville. Now we're going to join US Highway 79 and 70. I'm going to skip the rest of Memphis. So I already covered US 70. So I don't want to take very long for Memphis. We'll just only head into Arkansas. Wait, no, I can't. I'm going to continue. So here's the beginning of US Highway 72 on this exit. Now we're going to join US Highway 51. Now we're losing US Highway 51. Now we're joining US Highway 61 and US Highway 78. Now we're going to join Interstate 55 for St. Louis, Missouri. Now we cross the Mississippi River and head into Arkansas. Now we're losing US 70 and 79. Now we're losing Interstate 40 for Little Rock, and we're signed for St. Louis, Missouri. Interstate 55. Now we're losing Interstate 55. We're signed for Marion, Sunset, and Wayne. I'm not going to say that. Now we're just going to join US Highway 49 and 63 for Brinkley and Jonesboro. Now we're losing both of them. So US 64, what are we signed? Hey, we get Augusta for 20 miles and Bald Knob for 32. Now we're joining Interstate 57 southbound. Now we're losing Interstate 57 and US 67. So US 64 signed for Conway. We get Interstate 40 and US Highway 65 for Little Rock and Conway and Fort Smith. We get Interstate 40 eastbound signed for Little Rock and 40 west for Fort Smith. It's also the same thing for Interstate 40, signed for Little Rock and Fort Smith, and we're signed for Hartman. Now we're joining US Highway 71, that will take you to Interstate 40. We get Interstate 540 for downtown Fort Smith, and we get Oklahoma City and Little Rock. Now we're going to lose US Highway 71, so US 64 will head into Oklahoma. And welcome to Oklahoma. We get Interstate 40 East for Little Rock and Oklahoma City. Now we're joining US Highway 59, and we're losing US Highway 59. We're heading into Tulsa. Now we're going to join US Highway 69. Now we're losing US Highway 69, so now we're joining US Highway 62. And we're splitting off with US 62, so US 64 will just head into Tulsa. We get US Highway 169. US 64 is signed for Sand Springs. We get Interstate 44 East for Joplin and Oklahoma City for westbound. Now we're going to join US Highway 75. Now we're losing US 75. Now we're losing Interstate 244. So now we're going to join US Highway 412 in Sand Springs with US 64. Now we're losing US 412. US 64 heading to Cleveland, Bristow, and Pawnee. US 412 is signed for Stillwater and Eden. US 412 will go into Eden and Tulsa. Here's US 177. In Perry, Oklahoma, we're joining US Highway 77 for a little bit. Now we're losing US Highway 77, so US 64 will head to Interstate 35. Interstate 35 is signed for Guthrie for southbound, and northbound is signed for Tonquah. Now we're losing Interstate 35. US 412 is signed for Tulsa and Eden. Now we're about to lose US Highway 412 in Eden. Now we're joining US Highway 81. And also, did US 60 join us too? And yes, we did in Eden, where US 60 is now splitting off with US 81, and US 60 and 81 are both turning right, so US 64 is turning left. Now we're joining US Highway 281. Now we're losing US Highway 281. Now we're joining US Highway 183 for Buffalo. We're losing US Highway 183, so US 64 is turning right. This time we're now joining US Highway 283. Now we're losing US Highway 283, so US 64 is continuing. Now we're joining US Highway 270. Liberal, Kansas, Guyman, and Beaver. Now we're losing US Highway 270 for Liberal and Guyman. And also US 83 joined us. And we're losing US 83 in Turpin. So US 64 is turning right. Now we're joining US Highway 54. Now we're going to be losing US Highway 54. We get a mention for US 412. And now we're joining US Highway 412. And US 56 is going to join us. We get US 287. In that circle, we're joining US 385. Now we're losing US Highway 385. And we are now entered into to New Mexico. Welcome to New Mexico with US Highway 56, 412, and 64. Now we're losing US Highway 56 and US 412 for Springer. We're signed for Ranton for US 87. Ranton. We're losing US 87, so US 64 will join Interstate 25 South. Now we're losing Interstate 25 and US 85. US 64, I am not going to pronounce that one. Here's US 285. Now we're joining our old friend US Highway 84. Now we're losing our old friend US Highway 84, so US 64 is turning left. In Bloomfield, we're meeting US Highway 550. And now we're losing US Highway 550. We're signed for Farmington. And we get US 550 signed for Albuquerque. In Shiprock, we're joining US Highway 491. Now we're losing US Highway 491. Now US 64 is turning right to head into Arizona. And welcome to Arizona. And US 64 ends. And US 60 will continue. So that is it for my newer version of US Highway 64. So it's uploading today. So peace out.